All the Time Person of the Year covers movie stars are supposedly nothing like you and me. They're svelte, glamorous, self-possessed. They wear dresses we can't afford and live in houses we can only dream of. Yet it turns out they, in the most painful and personal ways, movie stars are more like you and me than we ever knew. In 1997, just before Ashley Judds' career took off, she was invited to a meeting with Harvey Weinstein, head of the star-making studio Miramax, at a Beverly Hills hotel. Astounded and offended by Weinstein's attempt to coerce her into bed, Judd managed to escape. But instead of keeping quiet about the kind of encounter that could easily shame a woman into silence, she began spreading the word. "I started talking about Harvey the minute that it happened," Judd says in an interview with Time. "Literally, I exited that hotel room at the Peninsula Hotel in 1997 and came straight downstairs to the lobby, where my dad was waiting for me, because he happened to be in Los Angeles from Kentucky, visiting me on the set, and he could tell by my face, to use his words, that something devastating had happened to me. I told him. I told everyone." She recalls one screenwriter friend telling her that Weinstein's behavior was an open secret, passed around on the Whisper network, that had been furrowing throughout Hollywood for years. It allowed for people to warn others to some degree, but there was no route to stop the abuse. Were we supposed to call some fantasy attorney general of moviedom? Judd asks. There wasn't a place for us to report these experiences. Finally, in October, when Judd went on the record about Weinstein's behavior in the New York Times, the first star to do Subworld listened. Weinstein said he never laid a glove on Judd and denies having had non-consensual sex with other accusers. When movie stars don't know where to go, what hope is there for the rest of us? What hope is there for the janitor who's being harassed by a coworker but remains silent out of fear she'll lose the job she needs to support her children? For the administrative assistant who repeatedly fends off a superior who won't take no for an answer? For the hotel housekeeper who never knows, as she goes about replacing towels and cleaning toilets, if a guest is going to corner her in a room she can't escape? Like the problem that has no name. The disquieting malaise of frustration and repression among post-war wives and homemakers. Identified by Betty Friedan more than 50 years ago, this moment is born of a very real and potent sense of unrest. Yet it doesn't have a leader, or a single, unifying tenet. The hashtag #MeToo, swiftly adapted into hashtag balanced in pork, hashtag Yotambian, hashtag Anna Kamen, and many others, which to date has provided an umbrella of solidarity for millions of people to come forward with their stories, is part of the picture, but not all of it. This reckoning appears to have sprung up overnight, but it has actually been simmering for years, decades, centuries. Women have had it with bosses and coworkers who not only cross boundaries but don't even seem to know that boundaries exist. They've had it with the fear of retaliation, of being blackballed, of being fired from a job they can't afford to lose. They've had it with the code of going along to get along. They've had it with men who use their power to take what they want from women. These silence breakers have started a revolution of refusal, gathering strength by the day. And in the past 2 months alone, their collective anger has spurred immediate and shocking results. Nearly every day, CEOs have been fired, moguls toppled, icons disgraced. In some cases, criminal charges have been brought. Emboldened by Judd, Rose McGowan, and a host of other prominent accusers, women everywhere have begun to speak out about the inappropriate, abusive, and in some cases illegal behavior they've faced. When multiple harassment claims bring down a charmer like former Today Show host Matt Lauer, women who thought they had no recourse see a new, wide-open door. When a movie star says hashtag #MeToo, it becomes easier to believe the cook who's been quietly enduring for years. The women and men who have broken their silence span all races. all income classes, all occupations, and virtually all corners of the globe. They might labor in California fields, or behind the front desk at New York City's Regal Plaza Hotel, or in the European Parliament. They're part of a movement that has no formal name, but now they have a voice. In a windowless room at a two-story soundstage in San Francisco's Mission District, a group of women from different worlds met for the first time. Judd, every bit the movie star in towering heels, leaned in to shake hands with Isabel Pascual, a woman from Mexico who works picking strawberries and asked to use a pseudonym to protect her family. Beside her, Susan Fowler, a former Uber engineer, 8 months pregnant, spoke softly with Adama Iwu, a corporate lobbyist in Sacramento. A young hospital worker who had flown in from Texas completed the circle. She too is a victim of sexual harassment but was there anonymously, she said, as an act of solidarity to represent all those who could not speak out. From a distance, these women could not have looked more different. Their ages, their families, their religions and their ethnicities were all a world apart. Their incomes differed not by degree but by universe. Iwu pays more in rent each month than Pascual makes in 2 months. But on that November morning, what separated them was less important than what brought them together. A shared experience. Over the course of 6 weeks, Time interviewed dozens of people representing at least as many industries, all of whom had summoned extraordinary personal courage to speak out about sexual harassment at their jobs. They often had eerily similar stories to share. In almost every case, they described not only the vulgarity of the harassment itself, years of lewd comments, forced kisses, opportunistic gropes, but also the emotional and psychological fallout from those advances. Almost everybody described wrestling with a palpable sense of shame. Had she somehow asked for it? Could she have deflected it? Was she making a big deal out of nothing? I thought, what just happened? Why didn't I react? Says the anonymous hospital worker who fears for her family's livelihood should her story come out. In her small community, I kept thinking, did I do something? Did I say something? Did I look a certain way to make him think that was okay? It's a poisonous, useless thought, she adds. But how do you avoid it? She remembers the shirt she was wearing that day. She can still feel the heat of her harasser's hands on her body. Nearly all of the people Time interviewed about their experiences expressed a crushing fear of what would happen to them personally, to their families, or to their jobs if they spoke up. For some, the fear was born of a threat of physical violence. Pascual felt trapped and terrified when her harasser began to stalk her at home, but felt she was powerless to stop him. If she told anyone, the abuser warned her, he would come after her or her children. Those who are often most vulnerable in society: immigrants, people of color, people with disabilities, low-income workers, and LGBTQ people described many types of dread. If they raised their voices, would they be fired? Would their communities turn against them? Would they be killed? According to a 2015 survey by the National Center for Transgender Equality, 47% of transgender people report being sexually assaulted at some point in their lives, both in and out of the workplace. Juana Malara, who has worked as a hotel housekeeper for decades, says she and her fellow housekeepers didn't complain about guests who exposed themselves or masturbated in front of them for fear of losing the paycheck they needed to support their families. Malara recalls feeling the pressure of someone's eyes on her as she cleaned a guest's room. When she turned around, she remembers, a man was standing in the doorway, blocked by the cleaning cart, with his erect penis exposed. She yelled at the top of her lungs and scared him into leaving, then locked the door behind him. Nothing happened to me that time. Thank God, she recalls. While guests come and go, some employees must continue to work side by side with their harassers. Crystal Washington was thrilled when she was hired as a hospitality coordinator at the Plaza, a storied hotel whose allure is as strong for people who want to work there as it is for those who can afford a suite. Walking in, it's breathtaking, she says. But then, she says, a coworker began making crude remarks to her like, "I can tell you had sex last night," and groping her. One of those encounters was even caught on camera, but the management did not properly respond. Her lawyers say Washington has joined with 6 other female employees to file a sexual harassment suit against the hotel, but she cannot afford to leave the job and says she must force herself out of bed every day to face the man she's accused. "It's a dream to be an employee there," Washington says. "And then you find out what it really is. And it's a nightmare." Fairmont Hotels and Resorts, which owns the Plaza, said in a statement to Time that it takes remedial action against harassment when warranted. Other women, like the actor Selma Blair, weathered excruciating threats. Blair says she arrived at a hotel restaurant for a meeting with the independent film director James Chubak in 1999, only to be told that he would like to see her in his room. There, she says, Chubak told her that she had to learn to be more vulnerable in her craft and asked her to strip down. She took her top off. She says he then propositioned her for sex, and when she refused, he blocked the door and forced her to watch him masturbate against her leg. Afterward, she recalls him telling her that if she said anything, he would stab her eyes out with a Bic pen and throw her in the Hudson River. Blair says Chubak lorded the encounter over her for decades. "I had heard from others that he was slandering me, saying these sexual things about me, and it just made me even more afraid of him," Blair says in an interview with Time. "I genuinely thought for almost 20 years, he's going to kill me." Chubak has denied the allegations, saying he never met his accusers or doesn't remember them. Many of the people who have come forward also mentioned a different fear, one less visceral but no less real, as a reason for not speaking out. If you do, your complaint becomes your identity. Susan Fowler, the famous victim of sexual harassment, says the woman whose blog post ultimately led Uber CEO Travis Kalanick to resign and the multi-billion-dollar startup to oust at least 20 other employees. "Nobody wants to be the buzzkill," adds Lindsay Reynolds, one of the women who blew the whistle on a culture of harassment at the restaurant group run by the celebrity chef John Besh. The Besh Group says it is implementing new policies to create a culture of respect. Besh apologized for unacceptable behavior and moral failings, and resigned from the company. IWU, the lobbyist, says she considered the same risks after she was groped in front of several colleagues at an event. She was shocked when none of her male coworkers stepped in to stop the assault. The next week, she organized 147 women to sign an open letter exposing harassment in California government. When she told people about the campaign, she says they were wary. "Are you sure you want to do this?" they warned her. Remember Anita Hill? Taylor Swift says she was made to feel bad about the consequences that her harasser faced after she complained about a Denver radio DJ named David Mueller, who reached under her skirt and grabbed her rear end. Mueller was fired. He sued Swift for millions in damages. She countersued for a symbolic $1 and then testified about the incident in August. Mueller's lawyer asked her, on the witness stand, whether she felt bad that she'd gotten him fired. "I'm not going to let you or your client make me feel in any way that this is my fault," she told the lawyer. "I'm being blamed for the unfortunate events of his life that are a product of his decisions, not mine." Mueller said he would appeal. In an interview with Time, Swift says that moment on the stand fueled her indignation. "I figured that if he would be brazen enough to assault me under these risky circumstances," she says, "imagine what he might do to a vulnerable young artist if given the chance." Like the 5 women gathered at that echoing soundstage in San Francisco. And like all of the dozens, then hundreds, then millions of women who came forward with their own stories of harassment, she was done feeling intimidated. Actors and writers and journalists and dishwashers and fruit pickers alike, they'd had enough. What had manifested as shame exploded into outrage. Fear became fury. This was the great unleashing that turned the #MeToo hashtag into a rallying cry. The phrase was first used more than a decade ago by social activist Tarana Burke as part of her work building solidarity among young survivors of harassment and assault. A friend of the actor Alyssa Milano sent her a screenshot of the phrase. Milano, almost on a whim, tweeted it out on October 15. If you've been sexually harassed or assaulted, write me too as a reply to this tweet, she wrote, and then went to sleep. She woke up the next day to find that more than 30,000 people had used #MeToo. Milano burst into tears. At first, those speaking out were mostly from the worlds of media and entertainment. But the hashtag quickly spread. We have to keep our focus on people of different class and race and gender, says Burke, who has developed a friendship with Milano via text messages. By November, California farm workers, Pasquale among them, were marching on the streets of Hollywood to express their solidarity with the stars. Women were no longer alone. There is something really empowering about standing up for what's right, says Fowler, who has grown comfortable with her new reputation as a whistleblower. It's a badge of honor. Discussions of sexual harassment in polite company tend to rely on euphemisms. Harassment becomes inappropriate behavior. Assault becomes misconduct. Rape becomes abuse. We're accustomed to hearing those softened words, which downplay the pain of the experience. That's one of the reasons why the Access Hollywood tape that surfaced in October 2016 was such a jolt. The language used by the man who would become America's 45th president, captured on a 2005 recording, was, by any standard, vulgar. He didn't just say that had made a pass. He moved on her like a bitch. He didn't just talk about fondling women. He bragged that he could grab them by the pussy. That Donald Trump could express himself that way and still be elected president is part of what stoked the rage that fueled the Women's March the day after his inauguration. It's why women seized on that crude word as the emblem of the protest that dwarfed Trump's inauguration crowd size. All social movements have highly visible precipitating factors, says Alden Morris, a professor of sociology at Northwestern University. In this case, you had Harvey Weinstein, and before that you had Trump. Megyn Kelly, the NBC anchor who revealed in October that she had complained to Fox News executives about Bill O'Reilly's treatment of women, and who was a target of Trump's ire during the campaign, says the tape as well as the tenor of the election turned the political into the personal. I have real doubts about whether we'd be going through this if Hillary Clinton had won, because I think that President Trump's election in many ways was a setback for women, says Kelly, who noted that not all women at the march were Clinton supporters. But the overall message to us was that we don't really matter. So it was not entirely surprising that 2017 began with women donning pussy hats and marching on the nation's capital in a show of unity and fury. What was startling was the size of the protest. It was one of the largest in U.S. history and spawned satellite marches in all 50 states and more than 50 other countries. Summer Zervos, a former contestant on The Apprentice, was one of roughly 20 women to accuse the president of sexual harassment. She filed a defamation suit against Trump days before his inauguration after he disputed her claims by calling her a liar. A New York judge is expected to decide soon if the president is immune to civil suits while in office. No matter the outcome, the allegations added fuel to a growing fire. By February, the movement had made its way to the billionaire dream factories of Silicon Valley. when Fowler spoke out about her weird year as an engineer at Uber. "I remember feeling powerless and like there was no one looking out for us because we had an admitted harasser in the White House." Fowler says, "I felt like I had to take action." Barely 2 months later, Fox News cut ties with O'Reilly. Over the next several months, media outlets reported that O'Reilly and Fox News had spent more than $45 million to settle claims with women who alleged harassment. Wendy Walsh, a psychologist and former guest on the network, was one of the first women to share her story about the star anchor, but she was initially reluctant to go on the record. "I was afraid for my kids. I was afraid of the retaliation," she says. "I know what men can do when they're angry." Eventually she allowed her name to be used. "I felt it was my duty," Walsh says, "as a mother of daughters, as an act of love for women everywhere and the women who are silenced, to be brave." The downfall of O'Reilly, who has denied all allegations of harassment, would prove to be just the beginning of the reckoning in media and entertainment. In June, Bill Cosby was brought to trial on charges that he had drugged and sexually assaulted a woman named Andrea Constant, one of nearly 50 women who have accused Cosby of sexual assault over several decades. Although the case ended in a mistrial, it is scheduled to be retried in April. The fact that it happened at all signaled a shift in the culture, a willingness to hold even beloved and powerful men accountable for past misdeeds. Complaints at the University of Rochester helped expose harassment in academia. The chief executive of Sophie, the $4 billion lending firm, resigned following a lawsuit over claims of sexual harassment. Then, in early October, the dam finally broke. On October 5, the New York Times published the first story to expose Weinstein, one of the most powerful men in Hollywood and a leading Democratic political fundraiser, as a serial sexual predator. The revelation was quickly followed by New Yorker investigations that widened Weinstein's list of accusers and showed the incredible lengths he went to cover his tracks. Weinstein denied the allegations, but the levers that he had long pulled to exert his influence suddenly were jammed. Fellow chieftains refused to defend him. Politicians who once courted him gave away his donations. His company's board fired him. Within days, the head of Amazon Studios, an influential art publisher, and employees at the financial services firm Fidelity had all left their jobs over harassment claims. By the end of the month, the list of the accused had grown to include political analyst Mark Halperin, a former Time employee, opinion-shaping literary critic Leon Wieseltier, and numerous politicians and journalists. The Oscar-winning actor Kevin Spacey was scrubbed from a completed movie. The response to the Weinstein allegations has shaped the way people view women who come forward. In a Time SurveyMonkey online poll of American adults conducted November 2830, 82% of respondents said women are more likely to speak out about harassment since the Weinstein allegations. Meanwhile, 85% say they believe the women making allegations of sexual harassment. The movement on fallout quickly spread around the world. Michael Fallon, Britain's defense secretary, quit the cabinet after journalist Jane Merrick revealed that he had lunged at her in 2003, when she was a 29-year-old reporter. In France, women took to the streets chanting not only "Me Too" but also "Balance ton pork," which translates roughly to "expose your pig," a hashtag conceived by French journalist Sandra Muller. In the week after #MeToo first surfaced, versions of it swept through 85 countries, from India, where the struggle against harassment and assault had already become a national debate in recent years, to the Middle East, Asia and parts in between. Suddenly, says Terry Rienke, a German member of the European Parliament, who discussed her own harassment in a speech on October 25, Friends from primary school are women that I know from completely different surroundings that would never call themselves feminists were starting to share their stories. By November, the spotlight was back on American politicians. A woman named Lee Corfman told the Washington Post that Roy Moore, the Alabama Republican nominee for the Senate, abused her when she was 14 and he was a 32-year-old assistant district attorney. 9 women have come forward to describe inappropriate encounters with Roy Moore, including several who say he pursued them when they were teenagers. Moore has called the allegations false and malicious. Specifically, "I do not know any of these women nor have I ever engaged in sexual misconduct with any woman," he said in late November. The following week, radio host Leanne Tweeden wrote that Minnesota Democratic Senator Al Franken groped her on a USO tour in 2006, before he was in office. Several other women have since come forward with similar harassment allegations against Franken, who has called on the Senate Ethics Committee to investigate his own behavior. On deck, 5. Michigan Democratic Representative John Conyers resigned amid allegations that he had made sexual advances toward the women on his staff. He has said that the allegations are not accurate. They are not true. Texas Republican Representative Blake Farenthold has also found himself in the crosshairs after media reports that he used $84,000 in taxpayer dollars to settle a sexual harassment lawsuit with a former aide in 2014. Farenthold denies that he engaged in any wrongdoing and has vowed to repay the settlement. The accused were both Democrats and Republicans, but the consequences thus far have been limited and often filtered through a partisan lens. In politics, at least, what constitutes disqualifying behavior seems to depend not on your actions but on the allegiance of your tribe. In the 1990s, feminists stood up for accused abuser Bill Clinton instead of his accusers, a move many are belatedly regretting as the national conversation prompts a re-evaluation of the claims against the former president. And despite the allegations against Moore, both President Trump and the Republican National Committee support him. That political divide was revealed in the Time SurveyMonkey poll, which found that Republicans were significantly more likely to excuse sexual misdeeds in their own party. The survey found that while a majority of Republicans and Democrats agree that a Democratic congressman accused of sexual harassment should resign, 71% and 74% respectively, when the accused offender was in the GOP, only 54% of Republicans would demand a resignation, compared to 82% of Democrats. As another election cycle approaches, Americans find themselves trying to weigh one ugly act against another in a painful calculus of transgression. Is a grope caught on camera more disqualifying than a years ago assault that was credibly reported? What are we willing to forgive or ignore or deny if the violator shares our politics? Iva wasn't so long ago that the boss chasing his secretary around the desk was a comic trope, a staple from vaudeville to primetime sitcoms. Theyre wasn't even a name for sexual harassment until just over 40 years ago. The term was coined in 1975 by a group of women at Cornell University after an employee there, Carmita Wood, filed for unemployment benefits after she had resigned because a supervisor touched her. The university denied her claim, arguing that she left the job for personal reasons. Wood, joined by activists from the university's Human Affairs program, formed a group called Working Women United that hosted an event for workers from various fields, from mailroom clerks and servers to factory workers and administrative assistants, to talk about their own harassment experiences. It was a proto-version of the social media explosion we're seeing today, encouraging unity and reminding women that they were not alone. But even as public awareness about the problem of sexual harassment began to grow, legal and policy protections were almost non-existent. In the 1970s, most businesses and institutions had no policies on sexual harassment whatsoever, and even egregious complaints were regularly dismissed. In 1980, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, EEOC, the federal agency tasked with enforcing civil rights laws in the workplace, issued guidelines declaring sexual harassment a violation of Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. It was a victory, but with caveats. Even after sexual harassment became explicitly illegal, it remained difficult to lodge a complaint that stuck, in part because acts of harassment are often difficult to define. What separates an illegal act of sexual harassment from a merely annoying interaction between a boss and his subordinate? When does a boss stop just being a jerk and become a criminal? Because the Civil Rights Act offered no solid legal definition, interpretation has evolved slowly, shaped by judges in the EEOC over the past 37 years. In 1991, Anita Hill testified before the Senate committee confirming Clarence Thomas to the Supreme Court, accusing him of sexual harassment and bringing national attention to the issue. But, she says, the conversation was not about the problems in the workplace. It was about the fallout in politics. Even now, the contours of what constitutes sexual harassment remain murky. Some of the recent stories clearly cross the line, like a boss exposing himself to his subordinate or requiring that his researcher sit on his lap. But others feel more ambiguous. Under what circumstances can you ask a colleague about their marriage? When is an invite to drinks alone a bridge too far? Jonathan Siegel, a partner at the Philadelphia law firm Duane Morris, who specializes in workplace training, says he hears that confusion in the conversations men are now having among themselves. It's more like, I wonder if I should tell someone they look nice. I wonder when it's okay to give a hug. I wonder when I should be alone with someone in a room. He says, this uncertainty can be corrosive. While everyone wants to smoke out the serial predators and rapists, there is a risk that the net may be cast too far. What happens when someone who makes a sexist joke winds up lumped into the same bucket as a boss who gropes an employee? Neither should be encouraged, but nor should they be equated. Companies, meanwhile, are scrambling to keep up. Most large U.S.-based corporations now have fairly complete policies on sexual harassment, and many have anti-sexual harassment training programs and claim to be zero-tolerance workplaces. A 2016 EEOC report found that a company's willingness to protect so-called rainmakers, high-performing men like Kalanick, Weinstein and O'Reilly, though, be one of the most pernicious reasons C-suites and corporate boards overlooked harassment. It doesn't matter how good a company's policy is if its systems are ignored or don't work. So much harassment training is like an episode of The Office, says Victoria Lipnick, the acting chair of the EEOC. In some instances, sexual harassment training has even been shown to backfire. In a 2001 study, Lisa Shearer, an associate professor of industrial organizational psychology at the University of Nebraska at Omaha, found that while training increased knowledge about what constituted sexual harassment, it also sometimes had a corrosive effect on workplace culture. What was disturbing was that the males who had gone through training showed a backlash effect. She says, they said they were less willing to report sexual harassment than the males who had not gone through the training. Employers are also girding for future allegations and lawsuits. The insurance company Nationwide reported a 15% increase in sales of employment practices liability insurances between 2016 and 2017. And Advisen, which tracks insurance trends, says that APLI insurance price has increased 30% since 2011, which indicates that more companies are reporting losses. Corporate boards, wary of alienating female employees and customers and of drawing bad press, have been among the quickest to make changes. Uber, for example, which built its reputation on a willingness to flout norms, used to be a guiding light for small startups. Now nobody is pitching their company as the next Uber, says Fowler. There's a shift too. We're not disrupting anymore. We're trying to build something that's good for consumers and treats employees fairly. It's a start. State and local governments have also taken some concrete steps. In October, the Chicago City Council passed an ordinance requiring hotels to provide panic buttons to employees who work alone in hotel rooms. In Springfield, lawmakers passed a measure that will allow an investigation into a backlog of sexual harassment complaints in the State House. In Arizona, pending legislation would void non-disclosure agreements signed by victims of harassment to keep them silent. At the federal level, the House and Senate have passed new rules requiring members of Congress and their staff to complete mandatory sexual harassment training. A handful of senators have also introduced legislation to rein in what are known as mandatory arbitration agreements, legal clauses that can appear in employee contracts that prevent workers from suing their employers in court for any reason, including sexual harassment. Some 60 million American workers are currently bound by them. We're still at the bomb-throwing point of this revolution, a reactive stage at which nuance can go into hiding. But while anger can start a revolution, in its most raw and feral form, it can't negotiate the more delicate dance steps needed for true social change. Private conversations, which can't be legislated or enforced, are essential. Norms evolve, and it's long past time for any culture to view harassment as acceptable. But there's a great deal at stake in how we assess these new boundaries for women and men together. We can and should police criminal acts and discourage inappropriate, destructive behavior. At least we've started asking the right questions, ones that seem alarmingly basic in hindsight. What if we did complain? Proposes Megyn Kelly. What if we didn't whine, but we spoke our truth in our strongest voices and insisted that those around us did better? What if that worked to change reality right now? Kelly acknowledges that this still feels more like a promise than a certainty. But for the moment, the world is listening. With reporting by Charlotte Alter and Susanna Schrobsdorf, New York. Sam Lansky, Los Angeles. Kate Samuelson, London. Maya Roden, Washington, and Katie Steinmetz, San Francisco.